So we're going to hear some good stories here, and you're going to probably be sharing your stories too and questions, because this is going to be an interactive kind of talk here today. We had a treat of getting a preview of John's talk and all his pictures that he has, and I know you're going to enjoy this. This is going to be one of our exceptional talks of the year. So he's retired from the Olympian, and we immediately grabbed him and put him on the board of the Olympia Tumwater Foundation, and so he's on the board of directors. So rather than take up any more time and have more interruptions, let's have John get the interruptions, John Dodge, and let's get you back on the microphone here.
Thanks, Don. Oh boy, what a crowd. I guess there's nothing much to do on a rainy day, huh? Well, listen, this is a great chance to reconnect with some of my old readers and see some friends and meet some new people. The only downside is I do not have a book to sell you today. I don't know if that's clear to people, but we are in production. I'm scheduled for release in April of 2018, Oregon State University Press. Believe me, I'll keep you posted when the book comes out. We'll have some release parties around the community, around the region, and around the Northwest. So this is kind of a trial run, I guess you'd say. And we have Don to thank for that. He insisted we didn't have to wait for the book, that we could talk about it now. So it's good practice for me. You're going to see a PowerPoint presentation that, for those of you who know me, no, there's no way in hell I could have put this together. So we have John Friedman, the executive director of the Olympia Tumwater Foundation, to credit for what I think is a pretty nice piece of work. I fed him some photos and maps and text, but he's the guy that made this come together. And to me, it was a very generous offer. So thanks, John. Okay. So I want to start by asking, how many of you would consider yourself storm survivors? Well, there you go. This storm, when I talk to people about my book and that I've been working on it and it's been for 5 years, they often tell me it was one of the seminal moments in their lives, a time they remember vividly, where they were, what happened, what they saw, how they experienced the storm. They often put it in the same arena as their memories of the JFK assassination, or even the Cuban Missile Crisis, or John Glenn orbiting the Earth for the first time. And all of these events are occurring at the same time, the early 1960s. And in this case, the storm is just 10 days before the Cuban Missile Crisis started to unfold. And as I did my research, I saw a lot of connections between the Cold War and the storm, and a lot of the early warnings that the storm was advancing were provided by the military, ships at sea, coastal radar stations, Air Force stations, and many of them provided some of the initial meteorological information about the storm as well. Are you picking up in the back okay? Okay. So let's get started. I want to talk a second about what kind of storm this was. In the early hours and days after the storm, it was described as a hurricane or a typhoon, which isn't accurate. This storm, when we have a storm like this, they're generally fueled by a typhoon from the Western Pacific Ocean, but they're not a typhoon per se. They are a mixture of warm and cold air fronts and masses with a severe temperature gradient, pressure gradient difference that comes together and forms a type of meteorological bomb. They're called extratropical or mid-latitude cyclones. We have them on a fairly routine occasion, every 10 to 20 to 30 years, but every 50 to 100 years we get a really big one. And this one, I think I can say, based on all my research, is probably the strongest windstorm in West Coast recorded history. It covered 75,000 square miles up from the Bay Area up to southern British Columbia. The winds lasted 2 to 3 hours in most places. I tallied over 60 indirect and direct deaths. Indirect I call someone that maybe died of a heart attack or fell off the roof trying to put the antenna back on, or, there's a lot of different ways people died, but most of them were, the force multiplier in a storm like this were the trees. The trees were falling, they were landing on cars, crushing people, crushing homes, and that was the primary cause of death. There were over 300 injuries that required hospitalization all up and down the path of the storm. 53,000 homes either destroyed or damaged, according to Red Cross estimates. Property damage, if you include tree loss, was definitely more than $2 billion and maybe as much as $5 billion. I was asked to kind of compare this storm to other storms we've heard about in recent years. So one of the storms I point to is the Halloween 1991 perfect storm off the Atlantic coast that gained quite a bit of book and movie fame. It doesn't hold a candle to the Columbus Day storm. The pressure center in the Columbus Day storm was much stronger. The winds were much stronger. There were way more fatalities. That's one example. You can look at Hurricane Katrina. Now, Hurricane Katrina caused much more devastation and loss of life. However, the area of the Columbus Day storm was larger. Winds were comparable, in many cases, Katrina-like Category 3 hurricane winds. So in summary there, and then Superstorm Sandy, which happened just a couple weeks after the 50-year anniversary of the Columbus Day storm, had all sorts of parameters more serious than the Columbus Day storm. But the one thing the 62 storm here had was peak wind gusts that are unparalleled by these other storms. We did not have storm surges. Part of it because of the direction of the storm, it was on a south to north path. It didn't blow in from the west. It didn't pile up the water on the coast. I found very little stories or evidence of damage from storm surges. So here's an interesting map. This shows some of the peak wind gusts during the storm. This is a pretty good description of the region the storm struck. If you tally it up, I think it's about 10 places where we know for sure the winds topped 100 miles an hour. There's Cape Blanco right there. You see 145 plus. The plus is there because that was when the wind gauge blew away. They know that it was stronger than that. The estimate is 179 miles an hour. Some old Coast Guard personnel that were there swear it might have been 200 miles an hour. I don't know, but definitely more than 145. 131, that's the Mount Hebo radar station on the top of Mount Hebo on the coast near Tillamook. Their true estimate is more like 160. The problem was that in many places, the storm gauges, the anemometers blew out during the storm before often the peak winds had even hit yet. You see 138 miles an hour at Newport, Oregon, over 100 miles an hour in 3 or 4 locations in Portland. The highest official wind peak was 160 at the Nassau Air Force Station, Air Force Base. Now these bases were part of our West Coast network looking out for the Russians, trying to keep our eye on the bombers coming over to blow us away. But they kept good weather data. You don't see too much more of 100 in Western Washington other than one in Renton, and then a couple hovering around 100, including 98 in Bellingham. But these are big winds. These are hurricane force winds. Let me catch up a little bit here. So what made this storm so strong? I'm trying to anticipate questions, right? Now, I'm no meteorologist, but I have done enough research to feel pretty comfortable with some of these parameters. Probably this first one is the most important. The storm's low pressure system, the center of it, which moved south to north, was unusually close to land. It positioned the strongest winds over the populated regions of the Willamette Valley and Puget Sound. Many of the other kind of storms we get like this are more than 100 to 150 miles further offshore. When this one passed the Washington-Oregon border around Astoria, the center of the storm was within 50 miles of Astoria. So those winds in the southeast quadrant of the storm, spinning in a kind of counterclockwise way, were whipping right up the Willamette Valley and up Puget Sound, funneled between the Coast Range and the Cascade Mountains. Another critical factor, the upper atmosphere and the surface winds were both blowing in the same direction from the south, so they were mixing along the front of the storm, adding weight to the storm's might. The storm itself is moving at its own speed of 40 to 50 miles an hour, and that adds to the wind speeds in the storm. There had been heavy rain in the weeks, well, at least 10 days in advance of the storm. Heavy rains in the northwest that saturated the soils, making the trees more vulnerable to wind blow, windfall. And this is kind of an interesting one about just thinking of a storm as a living entity that goes through a cycle of birth, growth, maturity, decline, and death. Well, the big blow, the Columbus Day storm, when it made landfall, it was at the peak of its life, prime of its life. It was cooking. I threw this slide in to help you understand why I took on this project. Plus, it gives us a little brewery connection. This is the Thompson Place home of Olympia Brewing Company tour guide Bill Kildee. If you look right here, this is where I was during the storm. Our family had decided we would be safer over at his house than to be at home in the woods out off of Kinwood Road. Turns out it was wrong. But both our families were huddled inside the family room watching this storm, which was careless, not smart. The window could have blown out and cut us to pieces. Big Doug fir came down and landed across the patio and onto the house. In a way, it actually looks worse than it is, but it was a very memorable moment for a 14-year-old boy. This is one reason I took on the project. Another one is that at the 50-year anniversary of the storm, Cliff Mast, some would say the high priest of Pacific Northwest weather, the atmospheric scientist from the University of Washington who has a very popular weather blog with over 30 million hits in the last 7 years. Some of you, I'm sure, listen to him on KUOW on Friday nights. And very well known. He loves weather. He loves to bring it to the people. He's a disciple of Carl Sagan, and so he loves to bring science to us commoners. And he does a good job of it. He loves this storm. He puts on his blog at the 50-year anniversary, he wrote about, someone's got to do a book about this. It's never been done. What's wrong with those authors out there, you know? And I took it on as a personal challenge and researched for 4 or 5 months before I approached him and said, well, who else is interested? Who else did you entice? And he said, you're it. I said, well, good. I didn't want to be in competition. So I kind of took ownership of the project and went on with it. A third thing happened in right around the 50-year anniversary as I was working on a column for the paper about the storm. I met a man in Shelton, Mason County, Bill Bruder, who was a typhoon tracker. Is Bill here? Anyway, okay. Well, Bill was assigned to the Agana Air Force Base, Agana Naval Station on Guam. And they had 2 missions. Their job was to go out and monitor and track developing tropical storms and typhoons to provide information about what American and foreign installations and military installations and civilian populations were in harm's way. They were also assigned the job of tracking Russian submarines. Again, the Cold War connection. So he was assigned to Lockheed Constellation. supercraft with tons of radar. And this next slide kind of goes along with that. Here you see the path of Typhoon Frida, which formed over here in the Marshall Islands on October 3rd. Bill and his crew were dispatched into the air to track this typhoon. It kind of did a little zig and a zag over the next several days, reached typhoon status on the 3rd, maintained it all the way through the 9th. Now they're pretty far across the Pacific Ocean. On the 10th, he could still see the storm started to dissipate, but it was still a strong form, a strong storm with potentially devastating consequences. And he radioed back to his superiors in Pearl Harbor, said, "You want us to keep tracking this storm? It looks like it's not ready to give up." And he said, "No, come on back. They always dissipate, nothing to worry about." So his crew followed orders. They returned to Guam. Over the next 2 days, the storm covered a lot of ground, settled off the northern Oregon coast on the 11th, got whipped together with some low and high pressure fronts from the Aleutian Islands in the tropical south, became a bomb, and then shot up the coast on the 12th. And he learned about the effect of the storm laying in his barracks reading Stars and Stripes on the 13th of October. And so he's had this "I told you so" moment all his life, and he kind of he shared it with me, and I think it's always kind of ate at him that they didn't take him seriously. But so that storm covered a lot of ground, and that is a major component of the Columbus Day storm. Now the weather, the meteorologists on the West Coast in 1962 didn't have a clue what was going on out here. The first time they started to get it, there was no satellites providing weather data from satellites orbiting the Earth. They just put the first satellite into the air in 1961, and it was crude and it was upside down. They were getting upside down images and day only images, and not full coverage of the Pacific. So they were getting most of their information from ships at sea that were stationed along the West Coast, once again looking out for Russians, and sending in weather data every 6 hours. They didn't have Doppler radar. They didn't have weather buoys out in the ocean. Weather forecasting was an art, not a science. So they didn't put out a real strong warning on this storm until what happened on the 11th. There was a precursor storm that followed a similar path, several fatalities, quite a bit of property damage, and they thought that would be the end of it. And it turned out that this second, stronger Columbus Day storm reformed in the same grounds and attacked the coastline in the early morning hours of October 12th. They put out a gale warning. And a wind advisory, but nothing like what actually occurred. The first meteorologist to really take this seriously was a fellow named Jack Capel. Now, one of the struggles with this book is finding a protagonist, because the storm's moving along. There isn't any one person to tell the story of the storm through it, but Jack comes pretty close. He was a respected KGW weather reporter, meteorologist in Portland, did a nightly studio show. Look at the crude studio graphics he's working with. He's just writing highs and lows on the board. We're still years away from the computer graphics and computer modeling of the weather. So anyway, Jack is looking at all these weather stations blinking out south of Portland late in the afternoon, and he just knows something big's happening in it. So in his 5:15 weather forecast, he says to his Portland audience that he thinks he knows, he feels it. He knows that something big is about to hit, and he warns people it's the biggest storm that he's ever seen. He hasn't even seen it yet, but felt, I guess, is what he meant. And he warns people to take cover. It could be a potentially lethal storm. He's making this pronouncement at 5:15 in Portland, and by 5:30, Portland is under siege. And he makes it back to the office in downtown Portland, and then the lights go out, and then their transmission tower blows over. And he stays on the radio all night till about 1:30 in the morning, trying to provide information, sketchy reports coming in. But he is kind of my protagonist. Jack's an interesting story. He was a D-Day Army infantryman, Battle of the Bulge, part of the Dachau prison camp liberation force, sitting in a foxhole in France one day, muddy, dirty, and hungry. He looked up at this beautiful sky and these beautiful cloud formations and said, if I live through this, I'm going to use my GI Bill and go back to school and learn what I'm looking at. And he became probably the most well-known weatherman in the Pacific Northwest. He later developed a form of Lou Gehrig's disease. He stayed on the air through a lot of debilitating conditions and then retired after 42 years. And he may have had the longest standing run. I don't know how long Jeff Renner lasted, but anyway, Jack was on the air for over 4 decades, and on the night he signed off, there was a thunder and lightning storm in Portland. I got a chance to interview him a couple times, not for the book, he'd passed away before that, but for other anniversary stories on the storm. So, on to some more damage pictures. This is the Gold Beach, Oregon Elementary School, part of it anyway, the gymnasium, after the storm hit. This is on October 11th, so like I said, there was a serious storm on the 11th. They were scheduled, this occurred at about 7 a.m. that morning. They were scheduled for a school assembly at 9 o'clock. There would have been 400 kids in here. There are so many amazing stories about life turning on a dime. There was a lot of lives lost, but as I look at the data and to hear the anecdotal stories, it could have been a lot worse. Okay, here we are in Newport. Recall I mentioned the 138-mile-an-hour winds. How many have visited Newport, spent a little time? Bayfront, the quaint little strip down on the Yaquina Bay. They say, and I have no photo to prove it, but accounts of a wall of sea spray over 100 feet high, splashing across Bayfront. People plucking seaweed off their windows of their homes a half mile inland. The Coast Guard abandoned their station at Yaquina Bay after the storm hit and the anemometer plugged out at 120 miles an hour. 20 homes were destroyed, but not a single person was killed in Newport. Ironically, the town that won the dubious distinction of most fatalities was Eugene, Oregon, with 6. This is the iconic photo of the Columbus Day storm, largely because here you see the storm in action. Something's happening. You're not just looking at what happened after the storm hit. You're looking at what the storm is doing in the moment. And here it's collapsing the Campbell Hall Bell Tower at Oregon College of Education in Monmouth, Oregon. Do we have some grads in the room? Anyway, now it's what's the name now? It's called Western Oregon University? So anyway, a college student was handed a box camera with 3 exposures by his instructor and said, and there's a big grove of trees right over here, a famous grove of trees that was planted when the college was formed in the late 19th century. So and the trees were snapping and breaking and falling, so he knocked off 2 quick photos of the grove, and then he looked back over at the tower and he saw some dust and down at the base, and he saw it was starting to sway, and then it swayed a little more and it came back, and then it swayed a little more and it came back, and he said, okay, I better save my last exposure for this. And he caught it, and that photo went around the world, became a double truck photo in Life magazine the next week. They paid him $400 for it. He went out and bought a new camera and the fanciest stereo set in town. And he's a great guy. I spent a day with him, gracious, just feels like he was the lucky right guy in the right place at the right time. But it's a great photo. Here we're looking at Dr. Dean Brooks, the superintendent of the Oregon State Hospital. He's on the roof of the maximum security wing of the hospital the day after the storm, chipping in and helping with repairs. Oregon State Hospital near Salem, was home to over 2,500 people at the time. It's a mental health hospital, much like, say, Western State in Steilacoom. He was trying to maintain order through the storm. There were a couple fatalities of trees and heart attacks among the patients. Three of them jumped out a window. I don't know if it was fright or flight. They all broke their legs in the endeavor. The hospital became famous 15 years later when he allowed Michael Douglas, Miles Foreman, and others, Jack Nicholson, Louise Fletcher, to come to the hospital grounds and film One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. So if you watch that film, and I did again a couple years ago out of curiosity, Dean plays himself. You see Dean in the movie playing himself. He does the admittance on Jack Nicholson, and it's more than a cameo appearance, but without him, that never would have happened. I think it shed a lot of light on mental illness and the plight of some of these people and the impacts of lobotomies, which he put an end to at his hospital. And to me, I love irony, and another point of irony is that in 1962 was the year that Ken Kesey published his book, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. So that happened the year of the storm. Okay. Now we're back to Mount Hebo. Now you're looking at what's called a radome, which is a shield over the radar that was under construction at the time of the storm. These hexagonal panels weigh 90 to 150 pounds. The wind got inside there and started tearing them apart, and they were flying around like frisbees, slicing through trees. The base was not evacuated, but everybody was told to take shelter in the barracks. This is a place where the winds probably did reach Category 5 hurricane force. It's an amazing place. It's a part of the Mount Hebo Ranger District of the National Forest down there. And you can drive up there, and on a clear day, you can see probably 40, 50 miles to the north and south. You can see every major peak in the Cascades. Now, the trick is on a clear day. There aren't too many. But again, another Cold War connection with the storm. Forestry was probably the biggest impact of this storm. Here we're looking at an image from the Siuslaw on the Oregon coast, where Siuslaw on the National Forest. Can you see the guy in the circle there, standing up there? This wasn't unusual amongst the folks that went out, the timber surveyors and cruisers, who spent 7 days a week, all day after the storm, setting up salvage sails and cruising the timber. I talked to a DNR employee here in Olympia who said that he can remember days where his feet never touched the ground. He was up off the ground sometimes 10, 20 feet, walking through this maze of fallen trees. The total is pretty well agreed that up to 15 billion board feet of timber hit the ground, enough to frame 1 million homes. The largest amount of blowdown in any recorded windstorm in the region, and more tree loss than any forest fire ever recorded, including the Occult or the Tillamook storms. They were in a big hurry to get the timber out. They were afraid of the Douglas fir beetle coming in and infesting the down timber and then getting into the green timber, and there were no environmental laws to worry about. They just got after it. They were selling timber within a week of the storm. And then you think, well, I wonder how that would work today. This is what was then called the Kelso Ranger District in southwest Washington, including North and South Fork of the Toutle River and the Green River. They had an annual harvest at that time of about 20 million board feet a year. They woke up Saturday and they had 800 million board feet of timber on the ground. And the amount of timber over the length and width of the storm was 3 times the volume lost in the St. Helens explosion in 1980, just to give you a sense of how much timber was out there. So consequences of all that down timber. For one thing, it kick-started the Japanese log export market. Up until then, we were Weyerhaeuser and DNR, not the feds were not exporting, but some state and private wood was going overseas, but very little. Then all of a sudden you got this glut of timber. The market picked up and it went from, say, 300 million board feet prior to the storm to 3 billion board feet a year in the late 60s. Japan was in a growth spurt coming out of World War II. They were hungry for wood. And some of us that have lived through the last 30, 40 years remember the never-ending debate about log exports versus manufacturing wood, doing the value-added products. Back then, there was some argument about it, but there was so much wood to get off the forest that there didn't seem to be much controversy. The storm triggered construction of hundreds, if not thousands, of miles of new logging roads to get to the fallen timber. Some of those logging roads became environmental, hazards, problems in the future with siltation of streams. And, by the 90s, we were spending more money abandoning roads than we were building them in our federal and private lands. And many of those roads were built quickly, substandard construction, a lot of slope failure, a lot of problems with those roads. So we can thank the storm for some of that. It also propelled Weyerhaeuser and other private landowners to dig into a new concept for their forestry, which they called new forestry, which involved aggressive tree planting, building tree nurseries, getting into tree genetics, fertilization, use of herbicides and pesticides, trying to accelerate tree growth to get a jump on natural disasters so they didn't get caught flat-footed again like this. That's had also some long-term, sometimes controversial consequences. Other consequences of the storm, in the Willamette Valley, up around Dundee Hills and all through the valley, there were a lot of filbert and walnut and prune orchards that were flattened by the storm. Many of them were not replanted. They lay fallow for years. Along came some entrepreneur wine growers, wine pioneers. They gobbled up these old orchards at a bare bones price, took a gamble, planted Pinot Noir and other varieties. You can make a case that the Columbus Day storm had a key role in the development of the Oregon wine industry. It's a story I've never heard before, and it's one of my favorite chapters. And I had a reviewer of my book, part of the process to get published, read it and go, well, that's not very interesting. I think that just belongs in the epilogue. And I kind of put my foot down and said, no, it's not going in the epilogue. The storm affected the 1962 World Series. When the storm hit, in that year it was the New York Giants versus the New York Yankees. 7 future Hall of Famers on those 2 rosters: Willie Mays, Willie McCovey, Mickey Mantle.
San Francisco Giants.
Hmm?
San Francisco Giants. San Francisco Giants. San Francisco.
Yeah.
Not New York.
What did I say?
New York Giants.
That's it. Yeah, so they were in the Bay Area getting ready for Game 6. And the storm hit, and the game was delayed 3 days. And so they finally played Game 6 on Sunday. And then on Monday, both teams were able to throw out their ace pitchers again because the rotation was all messed up. And it was a 1-0 game in the 9th inning with the Yankees leading. And Willie Mays hit a double into the, let me retrace that. One of the Alou brothers made it to first. He was walked or a single. And then Mays smacks a line drive into left field. Roger Maris is out there in left field. And the ground's so soggy and wet that the ball held up long enough for Roger to get to it and cut it off and hold Alou at third. And then otherwise he highly probable he would have scored. Then Willie McCovey gets up and hits a line drive to Bobby Richardson, and it's snagged, and game over, and the Yankees win. So that's kind of if you're a sports fan, it's kind of an interesting thought. Recall at this time, at the time of the storm, there was no natural disaster emergency planning, preparedness work going on. It was all civil defense based on Cold War reactions. So this storm, along with several other natural calamities across the nation in the early 60s, including the Alaskan earthquake and others, got people thinking that we need to reshape our civil defense and make it more of an emergency management approach for natural disasters, teach people how to take care of themselves for at least 3 days, talk them into buying transistor radios, which were brand new on the market back then. Some of you probably remember your first transistor radio. They didn't hit mass market production until '59. So you could say this storm had played a role in that as well. These are just some random damage scenes from the storm. The flattened car in Portland, the statue at the Salem Capitol campus that's toppled there weighs 3.5 tons. It's the circuit rider. It's backing up and running again. Not running, is it? Statues don't run, do they? Okay, John, slow down. You think of Portland, you think of Bridgetown, all the bridges crossing the Willamette and the Columbia. I think at the time of the storm, there were 9 bridges. At the height of the storm, 5 of them were out of commission. The St. John's Bridge had a vertical sway of 15 feet during the storm. The Hawthorne Bridge you see here, that's the result of a cargo ship docked on the Willamette, breaking loose of its moorage and smashing into the bridge. Just some kind of random storm scenes. There's a lot of them out there. Airplanes and airports took a real beating in the storm. More than 24 airplane hangars and 225 plus planes at 13 airports were damaged or destroyed in Western Oregon alone. This is a scene at the Hillsboro Airport just outside Portland. There were reports of airplanes, unoccupied airplanes, going airborne in the storm and flying over a mile before crashing to the ground. Okay, I got a trick question for you now. This is little Charlie Brammer. He lived in Spanaway. What happened to Charlie? Any guesses here? He went flying, yeah. Well, what he did is he got mauled by a lion. There was a neighbor of Charlie's who owned 2 lioness cubs. I've had a hard time getting to the bottom of how they got ownership of the cubs, but I'm pretty certain they got them from Point Defiance Zoo. The zoo they were always having surpluses of lions. They're not real forthright about how they got rid of them. But anyway, the story goes that they bought a couple lions from Point Defiance Zoo, built a funky enclosure in their backyard. It blew down during the storm. The lions are out in the neighborhood on the prowl. Charlie's out in the wind trying to fly, and he gets pounced on and mauled, and his parents get him into the house, and then a neighbor comes over in another car with a baseball bat, and they rush to the car to get him to the hospital, and they're beating the lion back as Charlie's and the dad are getting into the car. And Charlie's now a grown man, a plumber, works for Western Washington Fairgrounds in Puyallup, and they sued the neighbors. The neighbors didn't have any money. They ended up getting a $1,600 settlement, and they put it in an account. And when Charlie turned 16, he bought himself a Fairline Ford. So this question must be on everybody's mind. So what would happen today if this same storm hit the Northwest? Well, we can speculate a little bit. I think on the plus side, we'd have much more advance notice, 3 to 5 days likely, due to the advances in weather forecasting. You recall last October, they saw a typhoon forming in the Western Pacific, and a couple folks, including Cliff Mass, went public saying this could be the storm of the ages. It could rival the Columbus Day storm. It could be bigger than. And remember, we all rushed out and bought water and lanterns and provisions, and just a touch of panic in the air. And then the storm it was windy, but it wasn't that big a deal. Part of it is because it didn't get that close to our coast. It stayed out in the ocean further, but at least they saw it forming way over on the other side of the ocean, and we had a lot of advance warning. But then on the minus side, the region's population has nearly tripled since '62, so there's millions more of us in harm's way. There's millions and billions of dollars of built infrastructure and houses and houses and office buildings and plants, and that all of that would raise the possibility of property damage in the tens of billions of dollars. We have a different reliance on technology today than we did then. We'd have crippling power and communication breakdowns. I'm no expert, but I think it would be a very devastating storm if it were to hit today. But we're not seeing stronger and more frequent non-tropical windstorms in the last 65 years, and the computer modeling for this century stretching out into the next century doesn't see them either. The majority of the models don't see it. The jet stream, the main transport vehicle to get these storms over into our backyards, is shifting north. We could see more activity in Washington and BC and a little less in Oregon, kind of a wash. So maybe for us, we could see more serious storms. But more importantly, the Arctic region is warming more rapidly than the mid-latitude regions, which reduces that extreme temperature difference that creates those pressure gradients that fuel cyclones in the North Pacific Ocean. So we're moderating that differentiation in the northern latitudes, and that reduces the likelihood of these storms. With all that said, a storm as powerful as the Columbus Day storm could very well be in our future. Well, I've rambled on long enough. I want to thank you for listening to me. Now let's open it up to. Thank you. Let's open it up to questions if people want to share. I think we're in pretty good shape for time, aren't we? Okay, if people have specific questions, I'll try to answer them. If they want to share a storm story, I'd like to hear it. Yeah, go ahead.
My girlfriend and I were at the old Black Lake Fire Department Hall.
There was a political event, wasn't there, that night?
Mr. Christensen, I can't remember his first name.
Dick Christensen,
He's
running for governor. Yeah,
I called him before I ever.
yeah.
Wind picked up, lights went out, and had a heck of a time getting out there. And the one thing was interesting, a lot of the working men around the chainsaws, axes, swing decks, in a four-wheel drive loader. They're all over this county, cutting logs out of the roads and doing that all over. And I had just built two duplex that the builder designed in Lacey area, on what was called Apple Avenue at the time. It's all electric heat, and got really cold for a couple of weeks after this.
Mm-hmm.
Freezing. Yeah, they're heck of a time keeping warm, but my men, crew, they sort of went out to the area, and were doing freelance roof repairs just all over the
Yeah.
for a couple of weeks. People had their roofing going on.
And I think power outages in the Olympia area lasted up to 8 to 10 days in the more remote areas. We were out 8 days at our house.
Yeah, we were about 8 or 12 days right on
Yeah.
the plan, and Macy's or something.
Anybody else?
Also, I have a picture you I want to get. Ziegler Welding, the tree, they went alpine.
I have that picture.
Oh, you do?
Yeah, they gave it to me. That's
Oh, the
amazing.
tree-
Tree through a tree.
Oh, just like a.
Yeah, like a straw through
Yeah.
in a glass.
Up above, and came down and went right through about a 3-foot tree, clear through it. And a healthy tree too.
Oh yeah,
Wasn't a rotten tree.
I've got that picture in my office. There's a question back here. Yeah.
Our power went out in Vancouver for, it was like 2 or 3 weeks.
Wow.
My next door neighbor was a civil defense coordinator and got a hold of a 40 kW generator and parked it there between our houses, and there were like 3 houses all plugged into his generator, feeling all smart about it.
Yeah.
Having all the power, lights on.
Probably a lot of jealous neighbors too. Hey.
When's the book coming out and where can we buy it?
Yeah, good. He's my plant back there. I think I mentioned earlier that it's being published by Oregon State University Press in April of next year. And I'll keep you posted. There'll be lots of information about where to buy it. It'll be in all the stores, and we'll have some release parties around here of various types,
Will we be getting
alcoholic and non-alcoholic.
Are those of us who entered our email addresses, will we be getting emails notifying us of it?
Don will help me spread the word. Yeah,
Yeah, a question for you on the Navy side.
Yeah.
Do you have any input from the Navy as far as ships that were involved in the detection off the coast of Washington and Oregon?
yeah. It's been an interesting discovery journey for me. I found several seamen, Navy personnel that were on those ships, and they told me their stories, and I've told the stories in the book. And some of them didn't think they'd ever live to see the light of day. One of them thought their ship was breaking in two. It did. the hull cracked, and they had to go in for repair at Treasure Island. Treasure Island down in the Bay Area was one of the home bases for the Western Fleet. I think there was 8 or 12 ships on the West Coast and a similar number on the East Coast. A couple ships were in transit during the storm. A couple were on station. Their stories are really interesting.
I was in Northern California during that storm, and
Yeah.
I recall as much flooding as I did.
That's a really good point.
So could you comment?
I can. The third day, I mentioned this was a 3-day event. Well, all through the first and second days, the Bay Area was getting pummeled with rain. The third day, the storm was basically kind of stalled out over the Bay Area. They experienced record rainfall throughout the Bay Area, 10 to 20 inches of rain. Oakland experienced the worst mudslides in their history. 3 or 4 children were buried alive. Homes were washing off the hillsides. It was a big disaster in the Bay Area, and the rainfall, the flooding was the main culprit, not the wind. Yeah.
I was Sheriff. I was 16 years old. We were living on Wilson Street, just off 4th Avenue. And it was early evening, and things were really rolling. And I announced to my dear mother that this was too good to pass up, and I'm going to go for a little ride. And she begged me to not do that, but being 16, I had other ideas. Went out on 4th, out on Wilson, over to 4th, and followed 4th out to Martin Way, and it was howling. And I got out about the Bailey Motor Inn,
Yeah.
and a piece of sheet metal flew across the front of the car and cut a gouge right across the hood of the car. And with that, I decided she was right after all.
Yeah.
And turned around and went home, and we sat it out by candlelight.
Yeah. You know, when I say we, the citizenry of the Pacific Northwest had no prior experience like this to measure against or figure out how to act. People were out in it, you know. Their fathers were trying to get home to their families at rush hour in Oregon at the peak of the storm, driving through falling trees and dangled hot wires. And I mean, I'm amazed the death count wasn't higher. Yeah, John? I can't see everybody back there, but just shout out your question. Hopefully I can hear you.
So what significant things happened here in Thurston County?
Okay.
We should know
Okay, these are all great questions. We had 2 fatalities. They were the parents of the Archibald sisters, you know, the store downtown. There was a family of 5. They lived in Yelm. Roy and, gosh, I'm forgetting her first name. They were in a car on Bald Hills Road, and 2 trees came down and crushed the car and killed them instantly. They were the storm fatalities. There was considerable property damage. There was a lot of historic tree loss, including up on the Capitol campus. Boats were set adrift in Bud Inlet. But ground zero for this storm was Western Oregon, Willamette Valley. Not that we weren't impacted, and we were, but our peak winds were more in the 70, 80 mile an hour range. And wasn't quite as bad here as a lot of other places. Yeah.
And I was up in O'Connor, I was 10 years old, and we had a huge old barn, and half the roof just completely blew off and scattered all across the farm for the most of us. I think your traction, the winds up there are up to 90 miles per hour.
Yeah. Yeah.
What about the ferries?
The ferries, they shut down about 9 o'clock and didn't resume service until the morning. Elliott Bay was described as ocean-like swells and waves. One ferry that was docked up at Lummi Island sank. And it was not a good night to be out on the water. I have some water stories too. I got a lot of stories.
One last question?
Yeah.
How did that storm compare with the one that we just had recently?
I was wondering if anybody'd asked that. I'll do my best to answer that. Okay, she's referring to the wet microburst of May 4th.
Dawn, could you repeat the question?
Oh, sure. She's asking about the wet microburst of May 4th that struck specific areas of our community, some way harder than others.
How it compared?
Okay, I lived through them both. I was at ground zero for the microburst out East Olympia. And it lasted 5 to 7 minutes. And the winds, I believe, have been estimated at, and I would agree, at about 70 miles an hour, which is comparable to the winds of the Columbus Day storm here in Olympia. But bear in mind, those lasted for hours. But the types of damage you saw out in Indian Summer and East Olympia and Yelm Highway was very comparable to the Columbus Day storm type of tree damage.
I live on Ridge Road,
Yeah,
and I lived on Ridge Road when we had the Columbus Day storm.
okay,
And I seen more damage with our neighbors
on this one.
last storm than I did the Columbus Day storm. And the funny thing is, if you look out our window, you can see where the trees just were cut off. But one of my neighbors on 74th, that's been out there as long as we have, they cut a couple of their bigger trees down because they didn't know if they were rotten. They took out 7 loads of logs off that property. And it's on 74th, they've got 5 acres.
Yeah, I've got a friend with 20 acres off Defiance Road out East Olympia. He lost 1 million board feet of timber.
How much land's lost?
22 trees.
22 trees? Yeah, and just in that, 7 minutes?
Yeah, it was very, very violent. And another thing I should have mentioned, there was very little very little rain in the Columbus Day storm. It was a wind. It wasn't a wind and rainstorm, whereas the microburst, the rain was just as impressive as the wind.
Decided to hit our hallway when it hit.
Yeah.
John, I was in Portland, Maine at the time this recent storm was happening.
Uh-huh.
And they carried the news of it nationwide. So I found out that it pretty much is the same time you did what was happening here.
Can we take one more?
Do you know how the 62 storm compared to the 1921 storm that hit the Olympic Peninsula?
Yeah. Gosh, I feel like I've really been studying up on this. I'm going to answer your question, but I got a quick anecdote. A dear friend of mine, Jim Lynch, who's one of our top-notch Olympia authors, novelists, my literary compass, I call him. We're sitting around over a beer in 2012 after I take on this harebrained idea of writing this book. And he says, yeah, well, it might work, I could see where you might want to try it. He goes, look at it this way, John. Even if you never find a market for it, even if you never publish it, you'll become the guy that knows the most about the Columbus Day storm. So anyway, back to your question. The 1921 windstorm was much more localized. It swept up from mouth of the Columbia up through the Southwest Washington and into the Olympics. The blowdown, the 21 blowdown, is unparalleled in terms of the amount of blowdown in a smaller geographical area. It was billions of board feet. I can't remember how many. I have it in my notes, but it was unbelievably uniform and devastating along the west side of the Olympic Peninsula.
Bye.